a black doctor, exhausted after completing a grueling 72-hour shift saving lives, finally heads to the airport, longing to return home to his family. But the moment he enters the terminal, an ordinary trip takes a devastating turn. A security officer, driven by bias rather than protocol, accuses him of theft, humiliating him in front of a crowd. And then, just 6 minutes later, the officer is forced to face a truth he never expected, one that changes everything and sets off a chain of events that leaves the entire airport in stunned silence. Stay with me, because this is a story that reveals more than meets the eye. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story moves you. Don't forget to subscribe for more impactful moments. The cabin of Flight 823 thrummed with an electric quiet. Somewhere behind the rows of neatly pressed passengers, the low hum of engines filled the air with the familiar rhythm of flight. A kind of lullaby to those used to moving through the skies. It was an ordinary flight, or at least, it should have been. No one, save for a restless boy kicking the back of a seat in row 17, would have guessed the trouble brewing in the air. Marcus Eldridge sat in 12C, straight-backed and composed. He carried with him a stillness that could be mistaken for calm, though it was something closer to endurance. Years of practice had taught him the subtle art of containment, keeping himself small enough to slip under the radar of judgment, suspicion, or misplaced hostility. Yet here he was, uncomfortable in a seat that refused to accommodate his tall frame. He shifted his knees, hoping to relieve the strain, but the tight quarters offered no solace. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice steady and polite. "Miss?" The flight attendant, Ella Hartwell, turned sharply at the sound. She was a middle-aged woman with the kind of practiced efficiency that revealed years in the service industry. Her smile, when it came, was thin, perfunctory, the sort one wears as armor in a job that demands constant vigilance. "Yes," she replied curtly, already poised for dismissal. Marcus gestured toward an empty seat a few rows ahead. "Would it be possible to switch seats? I'm having some trouble with legroom here." Her lips tightened, her smile now a thin crack in porcelain. "I'm sorry, sir. Airline policy doesn't allow seat changes after takeoff." He nodded slowly, not ready to press the matter yet. "I understand. I'd appreciate it if you could make an exception. My knees are against the seat in front of me." There it was, something small, almost imperceptible. A flicker of irritation in her expression. A black man, well-dressed but firm, making a request that disrupted the order of her routine. There was no malice in her refusal. Not yet, but something colder. The kind of disinterest reserved for those whose presence barely registers beyond the obligations of politeness. "I'm afraid I can't help you," she said, the sharp edges of her voice cutting through the measured calm of his. "Please take your seat." For a moment, the air seemed to shift. Marcus straightened in his seat, his back stiff with the faint, familiar weight of dismissal. He wanted to let it go, to chalk it up to protocol or bureaucracy. But the growing ache in his legs demanded action. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still measured. "Miss, I'm not trying to make trouble. I just need a little relief. I wouldn't ask if it weren't necessary." Her shoulders stiffened. The hum of the engines grew louder. Or maybe it was the tension settling into the space between them. Passengers in nearby rows shifted subtly in their seats, their eyes darting toward the exchange without committing to open stares. "You're making this into something it doesn't need to be," she snapped, her voice rising enough to draw more attention. It was a small thing, just a seat, just a request, but in that charged moment, it became something larger. Marcus felt it, the way he always did, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Whether his presence, his insistence, his being, was somehow too much for the world to bear. "I'm asking for basic comfort," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "That's all." But Ella's patience, thin from the start, was gone. "Sir, I told you, it's against policy. I need you to drop this and sit down." And there it was, the shift, the crack in the illusion of civility. Marcus's request was no longer about comfort, it had become an affront, an inconvenience. The tension spread like a ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to read the moment. Was he being unreasonable? Was she being unfair? The boundaries of decorum were fraying, and no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of an unfolding scene. Marcus exhaled, slow and deliberate. He had been here before. In this uncharted territory where a simple request becomes a test of wills. Where the line between standing one's ground and being seen as combative blurs. He was not unaware of the stakes, never unaware. To press further might mean escalation. Might mean being cast in the shadow of every stereotype he had spent a lifetime avoiding. But to retreat? To surrender to the quiet indignities that mark a life lived under constant scrutiny? That, too, came at a cost. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," he said, his voice steady, unshaken. Her eyes widened slightly, the mask of professionalism slipping for a moment before she recovered. "You'll need to wait until we land," she said, the words clipped and dismissive. "No," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. "I need to speak to someone now." The exchange hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Nearby passengers, sensing the shift in tone, leaned closer, their whispers mingling with the hum of the engines. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a child's cry punctured the silence. But the moment was already sealed. This was no longer about a seat. It was about everything. The cabin of Flight 823 was no longer serene. The hum of the engines, once a comforting backdrop, now underscored the unease that had settled over the passengers. Conversations had ceased, and even the child in row 17 had stopped kicking his seat. Eyes darted discreetly toward row 12, where Marcus Eldridge sat still, his hands folded, his body taut with the weight of the exchange. He had asked for a supervisor. That was all, but in the charged air, it felt like more. Ella Hartwell stood near the galley, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the service cart. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a mix of indignation and uncertainty. She was thinking, though she would never say it out loud, about how things had escalated, how he had escalated them. It wasn't her fault. She'd followed protocol. And yet, the whispers from the rows around her felt like judgment, sharp and slicing, turning her professionalism into something brittle and weak. Sophie Hayes, a younger flight attendant, noticed the tremor in Ella's hands. Sophie had always admired her older colleague, but there was something off today. She approached cautiously, her voice low but steady. "Ella, maybe I should step in." "I could." Ella cut her off with a wave of her hand, her jaw tightening. "No, I'll handle it." But Sophie hesitated, her gaze shifting to Marcus. He wasn't shouting, wasn't gesturing wildly or making a scene. He just sat, his presence impossibly large, as though the space itself couldn't contain the quiet authority he carried. Sophie knew enough about the world to recognize the undertow here, one that ran far deeper than a simple dispute about a seat. She wanted to intervene, but she also knew better than to insert herself into something that already felt fragile. Volatile. Ella turned back toward Marcus. Her shoulders squared, her voice clipped. "Sir, I've already explained." "I heard you," Marcus said, his voice cutting through her words. "But I'm not asking any more. I need to speak to someone who can resolve this." His calmness, the way his words didn't rise to meet her sharpness, only seemed to intensify her discomfort. It wasn't defiance exactly, it was the steadiness of someone who had been here before, who knew exactly what he was doing. And that, perhaps, was the problem. Passengers leaned closer now, their whispers growing louder, more speculative. A man in a suit turned to his companion, murmuring, "He's pushing it, don't you think?" The woman next to him frowned. "Maybe, but she didn't need to snap like that." He wasn't yelling. These murmurs, so casual and detached, were not lost on Marcus. He could feel their weight pressing against him like a second skin. To them, this wasn't about fairness or discomfort. It was about perception, about whether he, a tall black man in a crowded airplane, was behaving appropriately. He'd been here before, in classrooms, boardrooms, and parking lots, where the line between persistence and belligerence was always thinner for him than it was for others. Ella didn't see that line. Or maybe she did, and that was the point. "I'm sorry, but I've explained myself already," Ella said firmly, her voice rising just enough for passengers to hear. It was a tone designed to reassert control, to shift the narrative of the moment in her favor. But the tremble in her hand betrayed her. "Are you?" Marcus replied, his tone measured, deliberate, "because it doesn't feel like it." Her breath caught, and in that pause, the air in the cabin seemed to thin. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. Calm, direct, and unrelenting. Ella's patience, already stretched thin, snapped. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling now with anger. You're making this personal, and I won't stand for it. And there it was, the shift. What had started as a simple request for a seat had become something else. Something unspoken but painfully familiar. Marcus felt the change immediately. He saw it in her posture, in the way her words bristled with accusation. She wasn't talking about the seat anymore. She was talking about him. About what his presence meant. What it threatened. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He didn't want this. He had tried to avoid this. But it was here now. And it was too late to turn back. I'm not making this personal, Marcus said quietly. But it feels like you are. The ripple became a wave. Ella's face flushed, her composure unraveling in front of everyone. She opened her mouth to respond. But the words didn't come. Behind her, Sophie took a hesitant step forward, glancing nervously between Ella and Marcus. Maybe we should. But Ella didn't hear her. She turned abruptly and walked toward the front of the cabin, leaving Marcus alone in the spotlight. Passengers stared openly now, their curiosity overpowering their sense of decorum. A few exchanged knowing glances, their expressions saying what they didn't dare voice aloud. Why didn't he just let it go? Why couldn't she handle it better? For Marcus, their stares were as familiar as they were infuriating. He'd seen them before, in grocery stores and department meetings, on street corners and subway platforms. The silent question etched into their faces. Why must he make it so hard? But Marcus wasn't making it hard. The world had made it hard. Long before this flight. Long before Ella's sharp tone and dismissive words. And now, it seemed, he was paying the price for asking to be treated with the same courtesy others took for granted. As the tension simmered, a new voice emerged from the galley. Sir? It was Sophie. Her voice was softer than Ella's. Less clipped, but no less cautious. Would you mind stepping to the back with me? Maybe we can sort this out. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. He didn't trust the invitation. Didn't trust that stepping away wouldn't be seen as an admission of fault. But the ache in his legs and the weight of the stairs compelled him to rise. He followed Sophie to the back of the plane, each step heavy with the burden of what he was leaving behind. The murmurs followed him, wrapping around him like chains. And though he couldn't hear the words, he knew what they meant. They always did. The quiet of the rear galley was no refuge. Marcus stood near the windowless door, arms crossed over his chest. As Sophie Hayes searched for words that wouldn't land like bombs, her smile was hesitant, meant to soothe, but he could see it for what it was, an apology she couldn't say out loud. Her youth showed in the way she fiddled with her uniform, her gaze flickering from Marcus's face to the floor. Sir, she began, her tone careful, like walking across a frozen lake. I understand this has been frustrating, and I'm going to do everything I can to help. Marcus met her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the weight of his presence. I appreciate that, he said, his voice low but firm. But you should know I didn't come back here to be calmed down. I came back here because I want this resolved. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and motioned for him to sit on the jump seat across from her. But Marcus remained standing, his height casting a long shadow in the tight space. His refusal to shrink physically or otherwise seemed to unnerve her, though she wouldn't have admitted it. Meanwhile, the cabin behind them buzzed with tension. Passengers whispered to one another, piecing together their own versions of the story. A man in the aisle seat near the confrontation leaned toward his wife. Why couldn't he just stay quiet? He murmured, glancing back toward the galley. People like him always. His wife cut him off with a sharp look. Don't, she said, her voice clipped. You don't know what he's dealing with. The man huffed but said no more. Around them, others exchanged glances, their unspoken judgments crackling like static electricity. At the front of the plane, Ella Hartwell leaned against the counter, her hands gripping its edge as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She hadn't meant to lose control. She was a professional, always had been, but Marcus's insistence had struck a nerve she didn't fully understand. She hated that he had pushed her to the edge, that his steady voice had unraveled her so completely. From the corner of her eye, she caught Dana Rivers, the airline supervisor, stepping onto the plane from the jet bridge. The sight of her crisp uniform and no-nonsense expression sent a wave of dread washing over Ella. She knew what this meant. There would be questions. There would be consequences. Back in the galley, Sophie was trying to find a path forward. I'm going to speak with the supervisor when we land, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But for now, could I move you to another seat? Something more comfortable? Marcus's jaw tightened. That's all I asked for, he said quietly, the calm in his voice more cutting than any raised tone could have been. I know, Sophie replied, glancing down at her hands. And I'm sorry. I really am. She meant it, Marcus could tell. But her apology wasn't enough, not because he wanted to punish her, but because the issue was so much bigger than her. It always was. This wasn't about Sophie, or even about Ella, not entirely. It was about a system that demanded his compliance and then condemned him when he refused to fade quietly into the background. It was about the way black men were asked, time and again, to navigate the minefield of other people's discomfort. Marcus leaned against the wall, his gaze fixed on the linoleum floor. You ever think about how small they want us to be? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Sophie frowned. What do you mean? They want us to fit, Marcus said, straightening. Into the seats, into the roles, into the silence. And when we don't, when we ask for more, that's when the trouble starts. She didn't respond. What could she say? That he was wrong? That he was imagining things? No, Sophie knew better. She couldn't deny the truth of his words, even if they made her uncomfortable. By the time the plane touched down at Cedar Point International, the tension had reached its peak. Dana Rivers was waiting at the jet bridge, her expression stern but composed. Passengers filed out quickly, their murmurs filling the air like smoke after a fire. Marcus was among the last to leave, his tall frame impossible to ignore as he walked toward Dana. Mr. Eldridge, she said, extending a hand. I'm Dana Rivers. I understand there's been an incident. Marcus shook her hand firmly. That's one way to put it. Behind them, Ella hovered near the galley, her face pale, her body rigid. She watched as Dana escorted Marcus toward a quieter corner of the terminal. She didn't hear their conversation, but she could feel its weight. Every word was a nail in the coffin of her career. She knew that. Dana listened intently as Marcus recounted the events of the flight. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. Dana nodded thoughtfully, her expression neutral, though her mind was racing. She had seen cases like this before, complaints, misunderstandings, tempers flaring, but this was different. This wasn't just about a seat change. This was about perception, about power, about race. When Marcus finished, Dana exhaled slowly. Thank you for sharing this with me, Mr. Eldridge, she said. I want you to know that we take this very seriously. I hope so, Marcus replied, because this isn't just about me. It's about how you treat people like me. Dana flinched inwardly but kept her composure. I understand. But did she? Marcus doubted it. He doubted any of them did. As he walked away, the weight of the moment settled over him like a shroud. He wasn't sure what justice looked like in a situation like this. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Behind him, the airport buzzed with the noise of arriving and departing flights. For most people, it was just another day. But for Marcus Eldridge, it was a reckoning, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, the ripple of injustice could become a wave. The terminal was alive with its usual symphony, flight announcements crackling over speakers, suitcases rolling across polished floors, hurried goodbyes, and distracted reunions. But for Marcus Eldridge, the cacophony faded into a single, pointed silence. He sat near a window overlooking the runway, watching planes ascend into a sky that seemed freer than anything he'd felt in the last hour. The slap of indignities he carried, not just today's, but all of them, gnawed at him in the quiet. Dana Rivers approached with measured steps. She had always been good at appearing unflappable, but Marcus's presence unsettled her. Not because he was loud or aggressive, he wasn't, but because he was composed, deliberate, and unwilling to be dismissed. That composure was unsettling because it forced people like Dana to confront something they preferred to ignore: that the system they upheld wasn't as neutral as they liked to believe. Mr. Eldridge, she began, sitting across from him, I want to assure you that the matter is being addressed. Marcus turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Is it? Her eyes flickered briefly, a crack in her professional armor. The airline takes these incidents seriously. I've spoken with the crew, and we're launching a full review. A review? Marcus's voice was calm, but his words carried weight. And how many times have reviews like this actually led to change? Dana hesitated. She wasn't used to being challenged so directly. Most passengers, even the disgruntled ones, just wanted an apology or a voucher to smooth things over. But Marcus wasn't like most passengers. He wasn't asking for something superficial. He was asking for accountability. And Dana wasn't sure she had the authority or the courage to give it to him. This isn't about one flight attendant, Marcus continued. This is about how people like me are seen. Or more often, not seen. It's about how quickly we go from being ignored to being a problem. Dana's gaze faltered. She had spent years in the airline industry, navigating complaints and crises. But this felt different. There was a truth in Marcus's words that she couldn't deny, even if she didn't know how to respond to it. We will handle this appropriately, she said finally. You have my word. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. Appropriately for whom? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Back at the gate, Ella Hartwell stood frozen near the counter. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, their discomfort palpable. She felt as though the walls of the terminal were closing in, each step she took reverberating with the weight of her actions. Passengers streamed past her, some throwing her looks of disdain, others barely registering her presence. She wanted to disappear, to shrink into the cracks of the polished floor. But there was no escape from what she had done or from what it had revealed about her. Ella wasn't a bad person. At least, she didn't think she was. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to manage difficult passengers with grace. But Marcus's steady insistence, his refusal to back down, had unsettled something deep within her. It wasn't just about the seat change. It was about the unspoken tension she had carried all her life. The quiet prejudices she had never confronted because she had never needed to. And now, they were confronting her. Her supervisor approached, her expression unreadable. Ella, she said quietly, I need to speak with you. The words sent a chill through her. She nodded stiffly and followed, her steps heavy, her heart heavier. Marcus walked through the terminal, his strides purposeful. He wasn't sure where he was going. His gate, the customer service desk, or maybe just away. But as he moved, he noticed the eyes on him. They weren't blatant stares, but sidelong glances, furtive and assessing. It was the kind of attention he had learned to recognize early in life. The kind that followed him into stores, onto elevators, into spaces where he wasn't expected to belong. Two women standing near a coffee kiosk whispered as he passed. Wasn't he the one? One murmured. I think so. The other replied. What happened? Something about a flight attendant. They said he caused a scene. Marcus kept walking, his jaw tightening. He had done nothing wrong. But the narrative was already forming around him, reshaping the truth into something more palatable for those who needed to believe it. It didn't matter that he had spoken calmly, that he had asked only for fairness. All that mattered was the perception that he was a disruption. He stopped near a row of chairs and sank into one, his body heavy with the weight of it all. For a moment, he let himself feel the anger, the frustration, the exhaustion that came with always being seen as too much or not enough. He let it settle over him like a second skin, familiar and unyielding, but he didn't let it consume him. Not yet. Back in the airline's office, Dana Rivers paced the small room, her thoughts racing. Ella sat across from her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The flight attendant who had once exuded confidence now looked small, her shoulders hunched, her eyes fixed on the floor. I've spoken to Mr. Eldridge, Dana began, her voice measured. He's understandably upset, and after hearing his account, I have to say, so am I. Ella flinched, but said nothing. Dana sighed, sitting down across from her. Ella, I need you to be honest with me. What happened back there? Ella's voice was barely a whisper. I lost my temper. He wouldn't let it go. And I don't know what came over me. Dana studied her for a long moment. It's not just about losing your temper, is it? Ella's head snapped up, her eyes wide with something between fear and recognition. What do you mean? Dana leaned forward, her gaze steady. You know what I mean. The room fell silent, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them both. Ella wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, she knew that what had happened on that flight wasn't just about protocol or stress. It was about something much deeper, something much harder to admit. And now, there was no running from it. As the sun set over the airport, Marcus stood near the window, watching a plane ascend into the dusky sky. He thought about the conversation he had just had with Dana. about her promises and reassurances. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this time, things would be different, but experience had taught him otherwise. Still, as he watched the plane disappear into the clouds, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. Not for the airline, or for Dana, or for Ella, but for himself, for the possibility that one day, the world might see him as he truly was, not a problem, not a threat, but a man, a human being. And for now, that was enough. The airport, a place of perpetual motion, seemed frozen in Marcus Eldridge's mind as he sat in the sterile quiet of an airline meeting room. The air conditioning hummed softly, a distant and impersonal sound, like the disembodied murmur of power. Dana Rivers had left to confer with management, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He had no illusions about what was happening behind those closed doors. Risk assessments, public relations, damage control, and a quiet debate over how much of this could be swept under the proverbial rug. Marcus wasn't a man easily shaken, but he felt the familiar chill of isolation creeping over him. It wasn't just the slap he'd endured, or the stares that had followed, it was the knowledge, deep and unrelenting, that this moment would not stand alone. It would ripple through his life, attaching itself to him in ways both visible and unseen. He was not just a man who had been wronged, he was a black man who had dared to demand better. And the world had always found ways to punish that. In another room, Ella Hartwell sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tremor in her fingers had subsided, but the tension in her chest remained. Across from her sat Dana, her professional mask firmly in place. "Ella, this isn't going away quietly," Dana said, her voice calm but firm. "The passenger has filed a formal complaint. The airline is launching an investigation." Ella nodded mutely, but the words barely registered. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, looping back to the moment on the plane when her temper had slipped its leash. She had told herself it wasn't about race, but that wasn't entirely true. Was it? The image of Marcus, tall, poised, and unyielding, lingered in her mind. She had felt it then, a shadow of something she couldn't name but couldn't deny either. "He just wouldn't let it go," she said finally, her voice cracking. He kept pushing. Dana's expression hardened slightly. Did he raise his voice? Was he threatening in any way? No, Ella admitted, her gaze dropping to her lap. But it wasn't what he said. It was how he carried himself. Like he didn't care about the rules. "The rules?" Dana asked, arching an eyebrow. "Or your authority?" Ella flinched. The words hit like a slap. Too close to the truth she had been avoiding. She had felt it on that plane, the unspoken challenge in Marcus's calm insistence. The way he refused to shrink or defer. It wasn't something she could articulate easily. But it had pricked at her pride, her sense of control, and it had made her angry. "I wasn't trying to," Ella began, but the words faltered. What was she even trying to say? That she wasn't racist? That she hadn't meant for it to escalate? That she was the victim of a momentary lapse? None of it felt convincing. Not even to herself. Dana sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Ella, I need you to understand something. This is bigger than you or him. The airline has a zero-tolerance policy for incidents like this. The optics alone." "Optics?" Ella snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "Is that all this is to you?" Dana's calm exterior cracked just slightly, her own frustration surfacing. "It's not about optics, Ella. It's about responsibility. And whether or not you like it. This happened on your watch." Meanwhile, in the terminal, the whispers had reached a crescendo. Passengers who had witnessed the altercation recounted their versions of events to anyone who would listen. Some described Marcus as calm and reasonable, others painted him as confrontational, even aggressive. The truth, as it often does, had become a casualty of perspective. "I saw him," one woman said to a small group near the coffee shop. "He was towering over her. She looked terrified." "That's not what I saw," a younger man interjected. "He wasn't aggressive. He was just trying to get her to listen." "Either way," another voice chimed in, "she shouldn't have slapped him. That's crossing the line." The debates carried on, each retelling shifting the narrative like pieces in a kaleidoscope. But one thread ran through every version: the unspoken tension of race. It lingered in the way people chose their words, in the pauses between their sentences. No one wanted to say it outright, but everyone felt it. By the time Dana returned to Marcus, the sky outside the terminal had darkened. and the artificial glow of the airport lights cast long shadows across the floor. She sat down across from him, her expression carefully neutral. "The airline will be issuing a formal apology," she began, her tone rehearsed. "We are also placing Ms. Hartwell on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of our investigation." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's it? Administrative leave?" Dana hesitated. "It's standard procedure." "Standard for who?" Marcus asked, his voice low but cutting. "Because I've seen how fast people get fired when the roles are reversed." Dana flinched. She couldn't deny the truth in his words, but she also couldn't acknowledge it outright. Instead, she fell back on the well-worn language of corporate diplomacy. "We take these matters seriously," she said, "and we will ensure a fair and thorough process." Marcus leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Fair for whom?" Dana didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she shifted the conversation, offering platitudes about the airline's commitment to diversity and inclusion. But Marcus wasn't interested in platitudes. He wanted accountability. He wanted justice. And he knew he wouldn't find it here. As Marcus left the meeting room, the weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. He passed a group of passengers who had gathered near a row of chairs, their conversation halting as he approached. He didn't have to hear what they were saying to know what they thought. He could see it in their eyes, the curiosity, the judgment, the quiet calculation of his worth. He kept walking, his strides long and deliberate. But the further he went, the more he felt the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He had been here before, too many times to count, and he was tired of it. Tired of being reduced to a caricature, of being forced to navigate a world that saw his humanity as negotiable. As he exited the terminal and stepped into the cool night air, he made a decision. This time, he wouldn't let it go. This time, he would make them see him not as a problem, but as a man. The storm was far from over, but Marcus was ready to face it. The drive home from the airport was long, a winding ribbon of asphalt stretching through the night. Marcus Eldridge's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The rhythmic thud of tires against pavement filled the silence, a steady beat against the chaotic symphony of his thoughts. The anger, the humiliation, the exhaustion, they all sat heavy in his chest, tangled and unresolved. In the glow of the passing headlights, he thought of his father. He could still hear the low, steady cadence of the man's voice, his words carved from the hard stone of experience. "You have to carry it," his father used to say, "because they'll never let you put it down." Marcus didn't need to ask what it was. He had known for as long as he could remember. The weight of being seen as less, of being held to a standard higher than most but respected less for meeting it. His father had carried it. And now Marcus carried it, too. Tonight, though, the weight felt unbearable. He pulled into his driveway and cut the engine. The house was dark, the neighborhood quiet. Inside, his wife, Janine, was waiting. She stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed, worry etched into her face. "You're late," she said softly. "What happened?" Marcus hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He wasn't sure how to explain the day, how to make her understand the storm that had unfolded. Not just on the plane, but in him. "It was a lot," he said finally, his voice weary. "The flight attendant, the airline, the stairs, all of it." Janine's expression softened, but her eyes darkened with understanding. She had seen it before, too many times to count. She stepped closer, her hands reaching for his. "What do you need?" she asked. "Right now?" Marcus said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I need the world to be different." The world was not different the next morning. The news of the incident on Flight 823 had spread, spurred on by social media posts from passengers who had been on the plane. The headlines varied in tone, some sensational, some skeptical, and some outright hostile. Passenger claims racial discrimination by flight attendant. One read, "Dispute on Flight 823 sparks outrage," declared another. But the one that stung most was a headline from a conservative blog. "When victimhood takes flight." Marcus sat at the breakfast table, his phone in his hand, scrolling through the comments beneath the articles. They were a toxic brew of opinions, ranging from supportive to outright vitriolic. "Of course, it's always about race with these people," one commenter wrote. "Maybe he should have just followed the rules." Another chimed in, "He's just looking for a payout." Typical. Marcus's jaw tightened as he read. The words weren't surprising, they never were, but that didn't dull their sting. He knew these people, even if he had never met them. He knew the way they saw him. Not as a man, but as a symbol of everything they feared, resented, or refused to understand. Janine reached over and took the phone from his hand. "Stop reading that garbage," she said firmly. "It's not going to help." "I know," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "But it's everywhere. They're already spinning it into something it's not." Janine sighed. "So what are you going to do?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, watching the wind rustle the leaves of the oak tree in their front yard. He thought about the promises Dana Rivers had made, the investigation she claimed was underway. He thought about Ella Hartwell, her sharp tone and the slap that still echoed in his mind. And he thought about himself, how easily he had been turned into the villain of a story that wasn't his to write. "I'm going to fight," he said finally. "I'm tired of staying quiet." By midday, Marcus's decision was set in motion. He contacted an attorney, a man named Andrew Hall, who specialized in civil rights cases. Hall was sharp, relentless, and unafraid to take on powerful institutions. When Marcus explained the situation, Hall's response was immediate. "They're going to try to discredit you," he said. "You know that, right?" Marcus nodded. "I've lived it my whole life." "Good," Hall said. "Then you know what's coming. But if we do this, we're not just fighting for you. This is about something bigger." Marcus understood that. He had always understood that. It wasn't just about the slap or the seat or the flight. It was about the countless times he had been made to feel small. The endless balancing act of being visible enough to matter but invisible enough to survive. This fight was about all of it. At the same time, Ella Hartwell sat alone in her apartment, her laptop open to the airline's internal portal. She had received an email that morning, notifying her that she was officially under investigation. Her stomach churned as she read the words, each one a reminder of how quickly her life had unraveled. She had tried to tell herself it wasn't about race, that her actions had been about protocol, not prejudice. But the more she thought about it, the harder it was to believe her own excuses. She replayed the confrontation in her mind. The way Marcus had looked at her, not with anger, but with a quiet disappointment that cut deeper than anything else. Ella had always considered herself fair, even progressive. She had black friends, colleagues, neighbors. She had never thought of herself as someone who could be part of the problem. But now, sitting alone in her living room, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she had been exactly that. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from a colleague, one of the few who had reached out since the incident. "Hang in there," it read. "This will blow over." But Ella wasn't so sure. Deep down, she knew this wasn't something that could be smoothed over with time. This was a reckoning. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself inundated with messages, some supportive, others hostile. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out, offering words of encouragement or advice. But the most meaningful message came from his younger brother, David, a teacher in Atlanta. "I'm proud of you," David wrote. "You're standing up for all of us." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He didn't feel proud. He felt tired, angry, and raw. But David was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black man who had been dismissed, every quiet indignity that had gone unchallenged. That night, as he lay in bed next to Janine, Marcus thought about the days to come. He knew the fight wouldn't be easy. The airline would fight back. The media would twist the narrative. And the world would find new ways to remind him of his place. But Marcus had made his decision. He would not be silent. Not this time. And as he drifted to sleep, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. The courtroom was more theater than justice. Marcus Eldridge knew this as he sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, the ceiling fans whirred softly above, barely stirring the air thick with tension. Opposite him, the airline's legal team huddled, their pristine suits and clipped whispers radiating authority. They had come prepared, wielding binders full of policies and statements designed to deflect, obscure, and deny. Marcus sat still, his expression calm but his mind racing. He had been here before, not in a courthouse, but in situations that demanded he justify his very existence. The unspoken rules of survival for black men in America thrummed in his memory. Stay calm. Don't raise your voice. Don't look angry, even when you have every right to be. Beside him, Andrew Hall flipped through his notes with quiet efficiency. "They'll go after your credibility first," Hall murmured. "They always do. Stay steady. We've got this." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. He wasn't here for a fight, he was here for the truth. But he knew the truth wouldn't be enough. The airline's opening statement was as polished as Marcus had expected. Their lead attorney, a silver-haired man with a voice like a well-oiled machine, painted the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Ella Hartwell, he argued, was a dedicated employee with an exemplary record. Thrust into a high-pressure situation. She had made a mistake. Yes, but only after being pushed to her limits by an uncooperative passenger. Marcus felt the words land like blows. Their calculated vagueness twisting the narrative. Incooperative. It was the kind of word that carried 1,000 quiet accusations, all aimed at him. It didn't matter that he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't threatened anyone. The implication was clear. He must have done something to deserve it. When it was Hall's turn to speak, his voice was sharp and unyielding. "This case isn't just about what happened to Mr. Eldridge," he began. "It's about the systems that allow incidents like this to happen in the first place. It's about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. For a moment, even the airline's attorneys looked uncomfortable. Ella Hartwell sat outside the courtroom during the proceedings, her stomach churning. She had been advised not to attend the hearing unless absolutely necessary, a decision her lawyer had framed as strategic, but which felt more like banishment. She stared at her phone, scrolling through the barrage of news articles and social media posts about the case. The public opinion was as divided as she had feared. Some defended her, insisting that flight attendants had an impossible job and that passengers like Marcus were the real problem. Others were less forgiving, calling for her termination and accusing her of embodying the very biases she claimed to abhor. Ella's finger hovered over the screen as she read one comment in particular. "She's just another example of how deep racism runs. Even when they don't realize they're doing it, they still do it." The words stung because they rang true. Ella had spent the past weeks wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that she had reacted not just to Marcus's persistence, but to the way his presence unsettled her. She had prided herself on being fair, unbiased, but now, she couldn't escape the truth. She had let her own unspoken prejudices dictate her actions. And it had cost her more than she was willing to admit. In the courtroom, the testimony began. Marcus spoke first, recounting the events of Flight 823 with quiet precision. He described the growing tension, the curt dismissal of his request, and the slap that had stunned the cabin into silence. "I wasn't angry," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I was frustrated. I wanted to be heard. But instead of listening, she reacted as if I were a threat." The airline's attorney pounced on the words. "Mr. Eldridge, are you suggesting that Ms. Hartwell's actions were racially motivated?" "I'm suggesting," Marcus replied, "that her actions reflect something deeper. Something we don't like to talk about, but that we all know exists." "And what is that?" the attorney pressed. His tone clipped. "That people like me are seen differently," Marcus said, meeting the attorney's gaze. "We're not given the same patience, the same understanding. We're expected to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. And when we're not, it's seen as defiance." The room fell silent, the truth of his words cutting through the air like a blade. As the trial continued, the focus shifted to the airline's culture. Hall introduced evidence of past complaints, highlighting patterns of bias that had gone unaddressed. Witnesses, both current and former employees, testified about the unspoken pressures they faced, pressures to prioritize appearances over fairness, to placate certain passengers while dismissing others. One former flight attendant spoke tearfully about an incident where she had been reprimanded for defending a black passenger who was being harassed by another traveler. "They told me to stay out of it," she said, "but how could I? It was wrong." The testimony painted a damning picture, one that even the airline's polished statements couldn't fully counter. Outside the courtroom, the firestorm raged on. News outlets dissected every moment of the trial, framing it as a microcosm of America's racial tensions. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs bearing messages like, "Justice for Marcus," and "Accountability now." But there were counter-protesters, too, their slogans a stark reminder of the divide. "Support our crew," and "Play the race card." Lose every time. The noise was deafening, but Marcus tuned it out. He had come too far to let the world's chaos distract him from his purpose. As the trial entered its final days, Ella was called to testify. She entered the courtroom with her head held high, but her hands trembled as she was sworn in. Her lawyer's questions were soft, leading, designed to paint her as a dedicated professional who had made a single, regrettable mistake. But when Hall began his cross-examination, the tone shifted. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, his voice measured but firm, "why did you refuse Mr. Eldridge's request to change seats?" "It was against protocol," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. "Is it standard protocol to slap a passenger?" Hall asked, his words landing like a hammer. Ella flinched. "No, of course not. I lost my temper." "Why?" Hall pressed. "What was it about Mr. Eldridge that made you lose your temper?" Ella opened her mouth, but no words came. She glanced at Marcus, who sat silently, his gaze steady but unyielding. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, forcing her to confront what she had tried so hard to ignore. "I don't know," she whispered finally. Maybe I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Hall asked. Ella's eyes filled with tears. "Of losing control. Of not being able to manage the situation. And did you ever stop to ask yourself why his presence made you feel that way?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications Ella couldn't deny. She looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. By the time the trial concluded, the nation was watching. The verdict would come soon. But for Marcus, the trial itself had already been a victory. He had spoken his truth, forcing the world to confront the quiet, insidious ways racism seeped into everyday life. He had refused to be invisible. And that, he knew, was the most radical act of all. As he left the courthouse that day, the sun setting behind him, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders shift. It wasn't gone, it never would be. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something else alongside it. Hope. The day of the verdict arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn. The air outside the courthouse was sharp and bracing, carrying with it a sense of finality. Marcus Eldridge stood by the large oak doors, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The sky above was a clear, cold blue, a canvas untouched by the turbulence below. Protesters on both sides of the case gathered, their signs raised like shields, their chants clashing like waves against stone. The tension inside was palpable. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, and the air buzzed with whispers and nervous energy. Reporters huddled in the back, their pens poised, ready to turn the next few moments into headlines. Marcus felt their eyes on him, but he ignored them. He had learned long ago that the world's gaze was not always kind. He turned his focus to the front of the courtroom, where the judge prepared to read the decision. His attorney, Andrew Hall, leaned over and whispered, "Whatever happens, you've done more than most would dare." Marcus nodded but said nothing. His jaw tightened, the only outward sign of the storm inside him. The judge began to speak, his deep voice reverberating through the room. "This court has considered the evidence presented, the testimonies given, and the arguments made by both parties. This case is not only about a single incident on Flight 823 but also about the broader implications of fairness, accountability, and the expectations placed on individuals within professional and societal contexts." The room was silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak, every breath. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let his anxiety show. He had carried too much for too long to falter now. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Marcus Eldridge," the judge declared. "The defendant, Coastal Skies Airlines, is ordered to pay damages and issue a formal apology, acknowledging the inappropriate conduct of its employee and the systemic failures that contributed to this incident." There was a collective intake of breath as the words sank in. For a brief moment, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. Marcus exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. He wasn't sure if it was relief or vindication. He felt perhaps both. Or neither. But the weight of knowing he had been heard settled into him like a quiet, steady pulse. Outside, the crowd erupted. Supporters cheered, their voices rising in triumph, while dissenters shouted angrily, their signs waving with renewed fervor. Cameras flashed as Marcus stepped through the courthouse doors, Andrew Hall at his side. He paused for a moment at the top of the steps, his tall frame silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Eldridge, how do you feel about the verdict?" a reporter called out. Marcus hesitated, the microphone thrust toward him like a weapon. He thought of all the things he could say, the anger, the frustration, the weariness that had carried him here. But instead, he said, "It's not just about me. This is about something bigger. And it's far from over." The aftermath of the verdict rippled far beyond the courthouse steps. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. The damages awarded were significant, but they couldn't erase the slap, the stares, the way his humanity had been called into question. The apology from the airline came in the form of a sterile press release, carefully worded to avoid liability while promising vague improvements. "This incident does not reflect the values of Coastal Skies Airlines." The statement read, "We are committed to learning from this experience and improving our policies to ensure the dignity and respect of all passengers." But Marcus knew better. Words were easy, change was hard. Ella Hartwell, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy, faced her own reckoning. After the verdict, she was officially dismissed from her position. The airline framed her termination as a response to her actions on Flight 823. But Ella knew it was just as much about public relations. She had become a liability, and they had cut her loose. For weeks, she avoided the news, unable to stomach the coverage. Her name had become synonymous with the worst aspects of the airline industry: bias, incompetence, even cruelty. But what haunted her most wasn't the headlines or the online vitriol. It was the memory of Marcus's face. His calm defiance, his refusal to be diminished. One night, unable to sleep, Ella began writing a letter. It wasn't an apology in the corporate sense, those hollow, performative gestures that did nothing to repair the damage done. It was a confession, an acknowledgement of the truth she had spent so long avoiding. "Mr. Eldridge," she began, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth." She wrote for hours, pouring out her guilt, her shame, her realization that her actions on that plane had not been isolated or unintentional. They had been shaped by years of unexamined prejudice, by the invisible forces that taught her to see people like Marcus as less worthy of patience, of grace, of humanity. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it aside. She wasn't sure if she would send it, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of peace. The broader impact of the case was harder to measure. Coastal Skies Airlines announced new diversity and sensitivity training for its employees, along with a hotline for reporting bias and misconduct. Advocacy groups hailed the verdict as a step toward accountability, while critics dismissed it as performative and insincere. In interviews and public appearances, Marcus continued to emphasize the systemic nature of the problem. "This isn't about one flight attendant," he told a journalist. "It's about how we're taught to see each other or not see each other. Until we confront that, nothing will really change." His words resonated, sparking conversations in workplaces, schools, and homes across the country. But they also drew backlash. On talk shows and social media, detractors accused him of playing the race card and blowing a minor incident out of proportion. Marcus had expected as much. But the vitriol still stung. "You're too much for them," Janine said one night as they sat together on the couch, the news playing softly in the background. "Too visible, too unafraid." Marcus smiled faintly. "Then they're just going to have to get used to it." As the months passed, the echoes of Flight 823 began to fade from the headlines, replaced by new stories, new controversies. But for Marcus, the fight was far from over. He continued to speak out, using his platform to push for deeper, more lasting change. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but he also knew it was a road worth traveling. Because this wasn't just his fight. It was the fight of every person who had ever been made to feel invisible. Every voice that had been silenced. Every life that had been diminished by a world too afraid to confront its own flaws. And as Marcus stood on that road, the sky above him vast and limitless, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.